Bob Herbert's OpEd.tv is made possible in part by the CUNY TV Foundation with the support of Ann Ulnick. Hi, I'm Bob Herbert. Welcome to OpEd.tv. We're back with Kostya Kennedy for part 2 of our discussion about his book, True, The 4 Seasons of Jackie Robinson. We pick up the story in the mid-1950s, and already the lights are dimming on Jackie's amazing career. So Kostya, welcome back again, and let's get right to work. Part 3 autumn is the year 1956. And it's a sad year. Jackie's skills are eroding. He's heavier. His body's taking a lot of punishment. It's starting to ache more and more. What kind of a season did he have?
Yeah, I mean, you're right to say that there's a certain sadness to it. And when I think about the autumn metaphor, it made sense. But one of the reasons why it appealed to me, there's also a valiance in there and a show of will by Robinson. In 1955, the year before, which was the famous year for Dodger fans where they finally won the World Series and beat the Yankees. It was a really, really tough year for Robinson. He didn't play so much. He was having certain issues with the management. He wasn't even on the field for Game 7 of the World Series when they finally beat the Yankees.
When they won the championship.
Yeah.
Right, he didn't play in that game.
And in 1956, he came back and really had quite a productive, good season. Nothing like peak Robinson. But when he played, he didn't play every day, but he played a lot, and he, in short bursts, was as good as he'd ever been, and really sort of rolled back time a little bit. He knew he was at the end or nearing the end. As you allude to, he gained weight. He would be diagnosed with diabetes that off season, so it's likely he had some early effects. And but he wanted to have one more day of summer, so to speak, and he did.
It was his last year in the majors, and he had only spent a total of 10 seasons. He came up in 1947. And he was 27 years old when the Dodgers brought him up.
Yep.
Can you speculate on how much better his career might have been, one, if he'd started earlier, which most, especially the great major leaguers, start earlier than age 27.
Yep.
And if he hadn't gone through all the stuff he had to go through, and not just the physical stuff, but the incredible stress, the unrelenting stress, would he have been a much better baseball player or had a much better or longer career?
I think longer with no question, and maybe better sooner, because when his first year in Montreal and then with the Dodgers, he was almost still learning to play the game a little bit. There wasn't the kind of coaching and the kind of infrastructure for black players that there were for white players as well. So he even when he came in at a little older in the minor league, say, than some of his teammates, they had much more experience in game situations and all that. So under different circumstances, there's no question it would have been a longer and very productive career. Robinson was so good at the pinnacle of his year, of his career. If you isolate the 4, 5, 6 seasons at his best, I can't speculate that he would have been even better than that because he was already, among the elites ever to perform in that way.
Let's demand that he be even better than he was.
Exactly. And it may be on some level that he thrived in the situation of having the attention, having the sort of challenge. He faced people who were rooting against him and racists who didn't want him to succeed. But from the beginning, he also had African Americans would say, when you get to the plate, you represent all of us, all of our people.
Right.
Think about that pressure, even from people who are rooting for you.
Right.
So
I used to hear that
pressure.
when I was a kid. I mean, I heard a lot. My family did not say that, and like I said, we were Giant fans. But I used to hear from a lot of others, both adults and kids. He's a black guy. He's playing on the Dodgers. You have to root for him for that reason. He represents all of us.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's a lot to carry, but it seemed like he thrived, but with very few exceptions, thrived on that, you know. And so you know, he had a great career. Certainly could have had more years. You know, the actual timing is a little bit odd to consider, because even if he'd been a white player, so many white players were out of baseball from 42, 43, 44, 45 anyway, right? So just timing-wise, even if baseball had been desegregated beforehand, he probably would have missed a good chunk of his career.
Right. In the, you know, you're talking about 1955 and 1956 being tough years for Robinson on the field. The manager of the Dodgers in those years was Walt Alston.
Yeah.
And he did not have a good relationship with Robinson.
Right.
What was the problem there?
It stems from Branch Rickey was the general manager who brought in Jackie in 47. And you go through Robinson's life and later in his political and social life, he was not afraid to sort of criticize anybody, even including Dr. King, who he had a wonderful relationship with, if he disagreed. But Branch Rickey was really like a father figure to him. He never had a father who was around, and he trusted Branch Rickey and really loved him.
Mm-hmm.
And plus, Rickey got a lot of credit, deservedly so, for putting his neck out to do it. Rickey would always say, "What are you giving me credit for? I just picked the best guy for the job," and he did it, right? But still, and so I think that then Rickey was kind of forced out by Walter O'Malley, who is one of the two Walts.
Yeah.
And O'Malley was the owner, and Alston came in as a manager and was kind of O'Malley's guy. And O'Malley, who, to his credit, was absolutely forward-thinking on issues of desegregation as well, but he was jealous of the credit that Rickey got. He would call Robinson a Rickey man.
Right.
Can
I interrupt you? You know what that reminds me of? It reminds me of Willie Mays, who was so beloved in New York City. And then when the Giants went out to San Francisco, like Mays, as great as he was, wasn't really their guy. They had their own, you know, and Robinson wasn't O'Malley's guy.
Exactly.
He was Branch Rickey's guy.
Yep.
Anyway, I'm sorry.
No, that's a wonderful analogy. That's exactly right. And when it gets into, and then I think Robinson also, he privately said he didn't really respect Alston as a manager.
Right.
Now, Alston went on to win a bunch of World Series and in LA too, so he was doing something right. He didn't like the way he handled Sandy Koufax. He didn't like certain things about his managing. So there was some friction there.
By this time, Robinson is the most beloved member of the Brooklyn Dodgers. When, you know, once you get into the mid '50s. So I'd like to talk about his relationships with some of his teammates. It's always been written that Pee Wee Reese was his best friend on the team. Was that true? Was that the case?
Very close with him. I mean, Carl Erskine was another guy, and Ralph Branca. There were a few guys, but Pee Wee, so Pee Wee was the captain of the team, even though it was kind of Robinson's team. Mm-hmm. And there was such a respect for the way Reese went about the game. Reese's wife and Rachel were close. So yes, you know, Erskine went on and Branca went on to maintain long relationships with him, as did other players on the team. Gil Hodges was very beloved by Robinson, and mutually so. So there were a lot. He had a core of people who were he was really close with. You know, Roy Campanella, it's overstated that they were not close. But at the
you
same
make that clear in your book. They had a real relationship, but it was complicated.
Question. It was partly their approach. You know, Campanella again was a little bit sort of, I'm so happy to be here, and I'm going to do the best I can, and I'm not creating waves. By the time we're in 1956, Robinson is continuing his baseball career, but he has begun his relationship with Dr. King, right? He has done work for the NAACP. He's out there beginning the sort of social work and the political involvement that would come to define his later life in a way that Campanella was just never going to go to. But Campanella won 3 MVPs. They weren't winning these pennants without Robinson. They weren't winning with great ball player and a kind, loving man. Just they had a different approach to sort of the larger thing that sometimes frustrated Robinson. Robinson,
by this time, is very outspoken on civic and political and racial issues. All bets were off. He was a big star, and there seemed to be no restraints on him. The thing that struck me was no athletes were doing that, black or white, in any sports that I can recall
Yeah.
in that era. What kind of reactions did he get for being so outspoken?
So again, like sort of all ways. This is a precursor to Muhammad Ali or Jim Brown or some of the people who came later and were outspoken. He criticized the Yankees were very slow to integrate,
Right.
extremely slow, both on the field and throughout the organization. And he openly criticized them and immediately got sort of shot back down by the Yankees and by other people. When he was brought into the commissioner's office, they're like, "You got to say what you got to say, Jackie." You know. So he gets support, and he had a TV show, he had a radio show at different times. He engendered reaction, right? Most athletes just engendered reaction whether they hit a home run or struck out. Right?
Exactly.
But he engendered reaction by who he was and what he was saying, and it did cut all ways, sort of, you know, and it probably explains why he didn't, or partially explains why he never had a job in baseball after he left the game, or why his TV career did not continue
Right.
beyond a certain point, and certain things like that.
At the end of the 1956 season, the Dodgers traded Jackie Robinson, shockingly, to the hated New York Giants.
Yeah.
What was that about? Why did they do that? And what was Jackie's reaction, both publicly and privately?
So there had been a period of time when there was rumors that Robinson might get traded, right? That they might try to get some good players back for him. And Walter O'Malley, as we've been discussing, was open to that because of the relationship. At the end of that 56 season, Robinson had made it up in his mind he was going to retire. And he actually took a job with Chock full of Nuts, which tells you how much baseball has changed. In those days, his VP of Human Resources job at Chock full of Nuts paid the same as he was making at the Brooklyn Dodgers. But when he took that job, he didn't announce it. He had promised Look magazine that he would reveal it in those pages, and that was coming out 6 weeks later or some such. In that interim is when the trade happened. And O'Malley would say,
So he was already going to leave.
He was going to leave. Mm-hmm. But when it first was announced, he didn't say that. He was honoring his agreement with Look. So he said, okay. He actually got a letter from Willie Mays, welcome. The photographers came up, took pictures of him with a Giants cap. Then the right time passed. On the eve of the story coming out, he announced he was going to retire. And so never reported to the Giants. And he maintained then, hey, I get it, it's okay, it's just baseball. But he never forgave Walter O'Malley or the organization for that. He didn't sort of come back into the Dodgers until the very end of his life when Walter O'Malley was no longer in the picture, and Peter O'Malley was saying, hey, that was a mistake.
Peter was Walter's son.
Was Walter's son, sorry, yes. For an older, beloved player to get traded, and you see it happen in sports and all that, and it's nobody likes it, but you can sometimes understand that's what has to happen. Sometimes it's good for the player himself to go to a place where they might win or have a new chance.
Willie Mays going to the Mets, for example.
And that made sense. Great analogy in the 70s. But Jackie Robinson, that just didn't seem, no.
I agree. It just, oh, my goodness. So pretty soon, Jackie's dealing with some very serious issues. You can start with the health issues. So can you describe what he was going through physically?
Yeah, so he had just had he was carrying the extra weight, he had circulation issues. That was really the main part of it. His legs hurt him, and he just had to sort of work through a level of pain and a level of discomfort, but he was there in the World Series, he had the last hit of his career, when he's obviously the oldest age he would ever be at. He gets a hit to win the game in Game 6 of the World Series. He continued to sort of will himself to be productive. Not only that, but during times of the year when he would get benched a little bit, Robinson he got out all his different gloves, first baseman gloves, second baseman gloves, outfielder's gloves, took ground balls at all different places. If Campy wasn't ready to go out to warm up the pitcher, Jackie would run out, warm up the pitcher. He was doing it. He was staying
Right.
engaged, and he never. His body ached, but he just sort of plowed through, and he continued to do that even after the game. He never sort of slowed down. It was not part of him.
So how long after he retired did he remain reasonably healthy? I mean, I know he suffered from diabetes, but
Well, so he retired in '56 and he died in '72. So essentially 15 years, a little plus. And he had health issues all throughout that time, essentially. He had heart issues, he had circulation issues, his eyesight went. But it never really stopped him, even against doctor's orders, from doing the things he was going to do. He traveled a lot, worked briefly for the NAACP. He very active as a speaker and in civil rights issues. So his health, he was basically managing it. He was diagnosed with diabetes right after retirement, and he was managing a declining health for those last 15 years to the very end.
and then in 1971 there was a devastating blow. He and Rachel lost their oldest child, Jackie Jr.
Yeah.
What happened?
So Jackie Jr. had been had a troubled life, and Rachel had talked about, not that easy to be Jackie Robinson Jr.
I could
Yeah.
believe that.
Right. And Jackie wasn't a particularly gifted he played Little League, but he wasn't
Yeah.
going to be some great, and he was always had that comparison and other things, and he went into the Army. When he came back, he had some drug addiction issues that were, devastating, of course, to the family and to him. And then he seemed to be well recovered. He went to a facility called Daytop and worked through that program, and then was working for Daytop,
Right.
and seemed to be beyond that, but it was still kind of fresh, maybe a year or so old. And he was coming back to their house. They lived in Stamford, Connecticut. That was the Jackie and Rachel and the kids' home. And he was coming back along the Hutchinson River Parkway here in New York, and got into a one-car crash late at night, and essentially had died
Wow.
at the scene.
Wow.
Yeah.
You could see Jackie Robinson publicly, and I still remember this actually, where you could tell at some point that there was a precipitous decline. His hair was all white, and he had trouble. He moved slowly, and you remember him as this great world-class athlete. So you knew that something was up. But you have a description of Jackie, and it's an extensive description of Jackie going to Gil Hodges' funeral. And this was after Jackie Jr. had died, but it must not have been very long after. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so it was the spring of of 72. Jackie Jr. died in the summer of 71. And this is part of the final season of the book, it's 1972, and it's the winter of his life. And this is an incredibly important event. So Gil Hodges died very early, 48, 49. And Robinson went to that funeral, and this is the first time that he had seen a lot of guys since Jackie had died, or in any number of years. So he ran into Joe Black and Don Newcomb. Pee Wee was there, Gil's family. It was extremely poignant day, and this was where he was sort of brought back into the game. I mentioned how he hadn't basically been in a major league stadium since he retired.
Right.
And very, very few blacks had any kind of job in major leagues. And Jackie didn't like that, so he stopped going. I'm not going to go to old timers games. And Don Newcomb did have a job in Major League Baseball. He worked in community relations for the LA Dodgers.
Right.
And it was at this funeral that they started talking, and Newcomb was like, hey, maybe you'd like to come out and do something. And that's what sort of got this 1972 year, which even though it was the last year of his life, was a very active year for Robinson, started. But when he got to Hodges' funeral, at one point he said to one of the guys there, I always thought I'd be the first to go.
Wow.
Because he knew what his health was like. When he got there, and I'd spoken with a man named Tom Valenti, and I had a chance to speak with Ralph Branca quite a bit, who's no longer with us. This was some years ago. And when they got to the funeral, Jackie was so compromised that he couldn't even really get out of his car.
Right.
He needed help to get out.
Right.
And then he sort of reassembled himself.
His
and was
teammates
able to
helped
go.
him
His
out.
teammate, yeah, Branca and Valenti, right, helped him get out of the car. So that's where he was physically. It was an extremely emotional time. And it was sort of led to this really interesting year of him being repatriated into the game that defined his life.
So what was that scene like when he did make the appearance at Dodger Stadium? This is after Gil Hodges' funeral, as you were saying.
Yeah, so
what was that like?
So he went there, and it was sort of an old-timer celebration weekend. Casey Stengel was there, and Koufax. So it was a sort of a star-studded afternoon, and here was Jackie Robinson. I spoke to a man named Fred Clare, who was then, I think he was in public relations, then he became the Dodgers general manager. And he was a young man with Jackie then. And he said they were waiting to go on to the field. They were in front of the dugout, waiting for it to begin. And somebody called out to Robinson, hey, Jackie, because they're always calling out to him.
Right.
Can you sign this? And threw him a ball. And Jackie couldn't see very well, right? And the ball just sort of hits him in the shoulder and falls down. And Clarence said everybody was incensed and started saying, Point, get that guy out of here, whatever. Right. And Robinson said, can I have the ball, please? He got the ball, and he signed it and said, please give it back to the gentleman.
Wow.
And that dignity made such an impression on everybody around, and his, it showed everything, what he was dealing with and how he was handling it. And Campanella hadn't seen him for a long time. Campanella at this point was in a wheelchair after his car accident.
He was paralyzed, right?
Yeah. And a week later, he was talking about it and just started to weep because of what had sort of happened to Robinson over the years. And at this point, he's only 53 years old.
Yep.
His body had a lot of miles on it, and the diabetes had taken a real toll, but he's still a relatively young man.
It just gave out, and it was October 4th, 1972. That's when he died. He died at his home in Connecticut. His wife was there.
Yep.
You write about his funeral and the procession from the church to the cemetery.
Yep.
Tell us about that.
So it was an incredible funeral. It was at Riverside Church in Manhattan, which can fit 2,000, and that day it fit twice as many or whatever, right? There are people all in and everywhere. Ira Glasser was there, right? People came from all over, family, friends, people who had just watched him play, all of that. Jesse Jackson gives the eulogy. Roberta Flack sings. It's like, at one point, Billy Lowe's, who was
goodness.
He was a Brooklyn kid who pitched then for the Dodgers.
Yep.
And he leaned over and said, it's like a Broadway show. And that's what it was. It's amazing.
I've never seen so many celebrities in one place.
Right, and all these people. Nonetheless, when they came out of there, Bob, and they were going to drive through Harlem, and as I alluded to, Robinson, he feuded with people. He had disagreement. He didn't see eye to eye with Malcolm X. When X was killed, he, of course, lamented it and talked about the points where they did agree, but didn't see eye to eye. He'd feuded quite a bit with Adam Clayton Powell, who was a tremendously important person, of course, in Harlem.
Big figure.
And that, and the fact that we were now somewhat removed from his heyday, people weren't sure what the reception would be when he sort of came out away from there. And Gerald Early, who's at Washington University in St. Louis and was a sort of a scholar of Robinson and other things, said, well, at that point I knew about Jackie Robinson. I thought he was my dad's hero. So people didn't know what the reception would be like. But what happened is they started driving out, and people came out of their storefronts. They came out of the schools.
Wow.
They came out of their taxis stopped driving in the middle of the fair, and they stood along the streets. There were 15,000 people, they said, along the streets, 5,000 at the mouth of the bridge waiting for him, 2,000 at the cemetery when they get out to Brooklyn. It was this affirmation, and some people giving the Black Power salute, some people just standing quietly, people of all different ages. Just an incredibly powerful moment to realize what he had meant, And for some people who had seen him or certainly been near him, it wasn't such a surprise that he died. We talked about his failing health. But if you hadn't really been paying attention, what do you mean? This 53-year-old guy,
what
so
a young.
shock. Yeah. So that's what that funeral was like, and it was obviously a very powerful day, and the day from which the rest of the family had to go on for, and his legacy built out of.
We're going to stop there. It's a very powerful book. The book is called True, The Four Seasons of Jackie Robinson. We've been talking with its author, Kostya Kennedy. Kostya, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Bob, I really enjoyed being on with you. Thanks for having me today.
I'm Bob Herbert. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.